Welcome to Indications and Warnings, everyone, with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording this broadcast of Indications and Warnings on October 28, 2025. It is day 1,343 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. The picture is changing swiftly, Chuck. That's why this program will focus on maps from Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. And from what I've seen, videos and photographs of Pokrovsk, which is where we will start, I have never really seen a war zone like this. Rubblized city, debris everywhere. It's a truly dark and to me frightening scene, and this is why this broadcast of Indications and Warnings is so much in your hands, Chuck, because you have this experience. It is, it's inside you. It's baked in, and so when we go to Pokrovsk and look at the map and talk about street to street fighting, that's where your experience is really going to come through and help listeners understand what is happening.
Well, a good place to start, and first let's put the cards on the table. The Russians have a force, and they are in Pokrovsk. From what we know from Ukrainian reporting, and I will also remind listeners, General Syrskyi cautioned his field commanders this past week, "I want to hear what's really going on," he said. So there may be some, what was that, a credibility gap? Was that what they used to say? Alan and I are old enough to remember the credibility gap.
Yes, the credibility gap during the Vietnam War.
Exactly. So battlefield reporting, it isn't just the Russians that are baking their numbers. So the good news is, if there is good news, there are approximately, from Ukrainian reporting, 200 reconnaissance sabotage Russian troops in Pokrovsk. That is euphemisms for Russian special operations forces. So these are higher caliber forces than are normally littering the fields around Pokrovsk. So this has turned into an urban battle in the southeast corners of Pokrovsk. And I'd like to reset everyone's clock. We've seen this battle space before. We've seen it in Severodonetsk, and we especially saw it in Bakhmut. So again, we get a lot of other military reporters, some of them quite credible and people I admire. And some of them, I call them those people with the fantods. Pokrovsk has not fallen. There is fighting in the streets, absolutely. But I will caution everyone to remember how long it took the Russians to take Bakhmut. And Alan and I remember when the battle was house to house on Patrice Lumumba Boulevard. Mm-hmm. So all is not lost yet. And we'll get into the nuts and bolts here in a second.
Yeah, and Pokrovsk is a much different city layout than Bakhmut, but of course the war itself has also changed significantly since the Russians took Bakhmut. That was really before the drone-saturated kill zone, but now that drone-saturated kill zone surrounds Pokrovsk. Somehow, whatever logistical obstacles Russians had, they overcame them to get these troops with supplies into the city of Pokrovsk.
Right. So so we're dealing with an urban battle space, and especially in two environments, maybe three. I won't cloud it with three, but there are two environments where if you are the soldier who gets there first, you are at an extreme advantage. One of them is the jungle or heavy forest. Whoever gets there first, leans against a tree and gets quiet, you're lethal. Somebody's got to crunch through the leaves and come to you. You get in an urban battle space, It's three-dimensional, unlike the jungle, which you essentially operate on one level. In an urban battle space, there are multiple levels, but again, someone wants to come to you, they are crunching on broken glass, right? It's almost inevitable that you're crunching on broken glass. Okay, so the Russians, let's talk about the chessboard. They've managed to get 200 troops into Pokrovsk. Here's the problem for the Russian commanders. 200 troops together, they're, multiple companies. That's pretty good. You can't put them all in one building because you're going to eat a French guided bomb. A hammer bomb is going to come right into the orifice you least expected to, right? So you have got to spread out. So how do you break that up? Is it 100 guys here, 100 guys here? It's more like 20 guys here, 20 guys here, 20 guys here. Now you've spread out the target, Alan, but as you know, now these units, they have to be mutually supporting, and it's heavy urban fighting. And we've talked about this before. You can go through 1,000 rounds a day. So that's like 25, 30 pounds of ammunition per man per day. That's a lot of stuff. Believe me, I've humped 1,000 rounds. It's heavy. Ammo's heavy.
And it's difficult in a practically demolished city like Pokrovsk for the Russians to deliver, especially that ammunition supply needed by its elite force in the city. I mean, where do you drop it? You can't say at the corner of 3rd and Elm.
Right. So, and I always look at these things as I was taught to do. You get a battle problem, put on the other guy's hat and start thinking, what would I do? Well, I would say, okay, you've given me 200 guys. I'm going to appoint subordinate commanders. We are not going to concentrate in one building. We're going to go here, here, and here. As principal objectives, my 4 units, supposing that I have divided them into, they've each got to grab a multi-story building and get to the top of the building as soon as possible. Because we also know the higher up you are in an urban battlefield, right? All you got to do is drop your water bottle down your stairs today at work, and you'll see how you win an urban battle, right? You just throw a hand grenade down the stairs. Okay, so a couple of things that are going on. Now I've got my force inserted, and I have got to depend on Russian logistics, right? So it's coming in by donkey, then it's being put on a drone, which can carry no ordnance. It can't blow up. It can either carry bullets or water, but it can't conduct a strike mission and a reconnaissance mission. So I suspect what the Ukrainians are doing right now is they are moving electronic warfare assets as closely as they can, not necessarily in the urban battle space, but possibly, right? You break up the electronic warfare gear, somebody humps the antenna, somebody humps the power source, somebody humps the gear itself. You want to dominate the electronic warfare, electromagnetic spectrum. Crazy, but the invisible parts of these battles, you can't hear it, you can't smell it, you can't detect it, but without it, you can't fight. So what the Ukrainians have got to do right now is find these units, isolate them, and extinguish them. And the bad news for the Russians is Ukraine doesn't have the biggest air force in the world, but they have shown repeatedly that they can hit targets on the battle line whenever they want to. And they're not hitting them with a drone, they're hitting them with a 500-pound French-guided bomb.
So in Myrnarod, which is the little town to the west of Pokrovsk, also street-to-street fighting with pretty elite Russian forces having infiltrated there, but also with a constant and heavy Russian artillery barrage. So this is developing into, I guess, what you would call a kind of classic urban battle, just as you would have seen in the Second World War.
Absolutely. I mean, that analogy is completely apt. But here's the thing that's going on. In the Second World War, you could set up your artillery, and the Russians still do this. They would set up their artillery hub to hub like it's on parade. And 70 years later, they still pull off stuff like that.
Yeah.
Believe me, it doesn't work. And what I'm getting to is the counter battery kill chain is so much faster now. So, for example, if there were Russian artillery battalions bombarding German positions in Stalingrad, you'd be lucky in 4 hours if you could get Stukas or, Focke-Wulf 190s to take out the Russian artillery batteries. Now it's a matter of minutes, right? So these Russian artillery batteries in major fire support, they either shoot and scoot or they get crushed. So here's one of the things that is coming. Look, and things don't exactly look rosy today here in Pokrovsk. We'll go to Kremenna, ditto, Kupiansk, ditto. But a couple things still matter. With the exception of the Russian special forces, most of these Vatniks have zero combat effectiveness. So we've heard President Zelensky report Ukrainian troops are outnumbered 8-1 in Pokrovsk. Sounds alarming. Well, they've been outnumbered 8-1 in Kremenna for the last 3 years. And what it comes down to, and Al and I speak about this all the time, combat effectiveness for Russian units is about 20%. They suck. They suck for two reasons. They're not trained. They can't read a map. They can't use a compass. They don't even know to run with a rifle and go, I'm up, he sees me, I'm down. They don't even know that. Okay. Here's the other good thing. Their officers suck. They're field grade officers, major to colonel. They're criminals. They're not tacticians. They didn't rise to their positions because they excelled at the staff college or the war college. They suck. And I hate to say this, my heart breaks when I see their junior officers, Russian junior officers, 6 weeks out of military academy, leading a platoon in combat with marginal training, and their lieutenants are dying in their thousands, just like American troops in Vietnam. You picked a rank that was going to get killed in Vietnam, it was second lieutenant. That's who got killed. So, cutting right to the end of the brief, the Russians are not going to take Pokrovsk overnight. It took them 3 or 4, 5 months to take Bakhmut.
Yeah.
Paying for it every day. Pokrovsk is going to go the same way, in my estimation.
Yeah. Well, remember, the assault on Pokrovsk, or the approach to Pokrovsk, started in February 2024 with the fall of Avdiivka. That's a long time ago. I mean, it's taken the Russians that long, since February 2024, to get into the streets of Pokrovsk.
And they've expended conservatively 75,000 dead, more dead than the entire Vietnam War, to get to the gates of Pokrovsk. And it's interesting to me that, a lot of, again, and I don't want to call it, I like to call it people when they're not good at their job. And you're not good at your job if you're saying the vital strategic logistics hub of Pokrovsk. It was like that last February, right? When Ukraine was defending Avdiivka, Pokrovsk was a logistics hub. Now it is a terminal point, right? It's not a logistics hub for anything. It is an urban combat zone. So the definition of an objective and your analysis of the objective, it changes constantly.
Yeah.
Right? This is no longer a key logistics hub.
No. It's another city that's been pounded into rubble by the Russians, and that makes it less useful both to the Ukrainians and to the Russians if they were successful in taking it. So Putin has a deadline in mind. It's November 20th, less than a month away. His previous deadline for taking Pokrovsk was October 15th. That was 2 weeks ago. And Gerasimov, General Gerasimov in Russia, is being called out for false reporting and for inflating Russian successes. So that creates a context for what's happening here in Pokrovsk. and we are relying on Ukrainian reporting. We know how bad the situation is, but you cannot put any credence into what Russia claims.
Yeah, and it's sometimes easier to unspool the Russian reporting and information. But I'll also point out, look, it was pretty important that General Sirski visited the front last week and admonished his commanders, to clean up their reporting. He wanted to hear what's exactly going on. It isn't great, but we know what the Russians are communicating, what they want to do. But let's not take that entirely at face value. What is likely? Putin does want Pokrovsk. He needs a city. He hasn't taken one in 2 years.
Yeah.
He needs one. We've seen how these penetration operations go in the cities, and to be quite honest I'll tell you, when they get in there, they're very hard to get out. And they generally wind up taking the city. But that is measured in months, right? As we saw in Severodonetsk, we saw in Bakhmut, it took most of a year to get through Bakhmut. In the case of Severodonetsk, the forest backed right up to a city street. The same thing in Kremenna. But that's not the case in Pokrovsk, which is flat and open, and everything that the Russians need to win that battle has got to go through the drone zone.
Mm-hmm.
And the shrinkage rate on deliveries is about 80%. So I want to send you 100 meatballs, only 20 are getting through. So it's going to be a long fight here. And Alan and I are going to blow up a street-by-street map of Pokrovsk, and we'll start following this block by block.
Yep. I think the next map we should look at is that wide-scale map so that we can see the connection between the ongoing battle in Pokrovsk and Minorod, and the salient that the Ukrainians have cleaned up in Dobropilia. I wonder, and there have been a couple of mechanized assaults, Russian assaults up around Dobropilia, as the Ukrainians have cleaned out the salients. Did this Russian effort draw Ukrainian defenders away from the center of Pokrovsk, from the outskirts of Minorod, where they might have been more effective?
Alan, you are getting promoted to lieutenant colonel right now. That is exactly what we can see in hindsight. And I don't mean you see it in hindsight. I didn't get it either.
Yeah.
I was gleefully reporting the fact that 16 infantry fighting vehicles and 2 tanks were smashed in an attempt to reach the encircled forces there that are still barely hanging on in that failed northern salient. But there is no doubt that Ukraine switched its attention to there, not realizing that a significant threat, and it's all relative, generally 200 guys isn't, so we're talking 2 full-strength companies, right? But these guys know what they're doing. So that was definitely the case. But you look at the price to pay for that diversion. 14, those kind of losses, 14 armored vehicles, that's like a defeat that's like the Kasserine Pass in World War II. That's an ass kicking.
Yeah.
And 3 of those were administered by the Ukrainians in the Pokrovsk area of operations just in the last 5 days. The Russians sacrificed 5 assault columns. Now they're into Pokrovsk, but what's into Pokrovsk is light infantry, right? Guy with a rifle and a grenade launcher. Maybe guys with a mortar tube, and RPGs. That's light infantry, right? That's not how you win a war.
It might have been a diversion up around Dobropilia, but it's a hell of a sacrifice the Russians made. And by the way, they made it continuously from the first reports of the Russian breakthrough in Dobropilia to these latest defeats of the mechanized columns in Dobropilia. They brought these infantry fighting vehicles and tanks forward, having kept them out of the battle for months, frankly. And we had not seen a Russian mechanized assault since what, Vuhledar?
Yeah, these were big. These were big attacks. But also, people, they keep their eye on this. At the beginning of the war, this would have been 10 tanks and 40 infantry fighting vehicles. Now the ratio is about 2 to 20. The Russians are running out of tanks. And when you see one of those porcupine turtle tanks going across the battlefield, bear in mind, it can't even use its main gun, right? They've got zero situational awareness. You are enclosed in this gizmo. You can't get out of it either, right? You see all the barbed wire everywhere and the gun sticking out a little slit, and it looks like the CSS Virginia. You can't get out of it. It's a death box. It's a doom machine, the death mobile,
Yeah.
like Animal House. It's just it isn't happening. So these are desperation type moves, but we'll see. The Battle of Pokrovsk is not going to be over this week. It's not going to be over next week. And attention to our Russian listening guests, it's not going to be over by the 20th of November for a lot of reasons.
Okay, we're going to keep looking at that. Russia has, as you mentioned, Chuck, suffered 350,000 roughly casualties so far in 2025. This is almost to the man the number of men and women that Russia mobilizes to send to Ukraine. It's a one-to-one exchange. So even though Russia has an 8-to-1 advantage here in Pokrovsk, it's not coming from a surge of new troops into Ukraine because they're losing just as many as they recruit.
It is staggering to think of this loss rate. Okay, imagine an Alabama football game with 100,000 people there. Now imagine 3 of those stadiums and everybody's dead. And try to imagine this. Everybody who put up their hand at the Russian recruiting station this year and came to Ukraine, they are all effectively, not all of the 1-to-1, but that exact number has perished, right? Has become casualties. So virtually everyone they sent in is now a casualty. And it's no coincidence that you and I have been reporting that same little factoid for almost 4 years now. It was true 1 year after the start of the invasion. Same thing. They essentially sustained casualties equal to the initial invasion force. Same in 23, same in 24. 2025 is almost over, and we're looking at that as well. Now, Putin's artificial deadline is, hey, he needs to get this done by November 20th. Look, then General Winter is coming, right? And the situation changes. Remember that old SEAL maxim, 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter? 3 hours. Well, what do you mean 3 hours? Well, you get out of your car and try to change your flat tire in Maine in the winter. Right? 3 hours in a blizzard, you might not even make it that long. Now you're living in a sand hole on Mount Desert Island, right? For 2 weeks. Look, I used to live in a sand hole, believe me.
Yeah.
It wasn't that fun.
It's not fun. So that's the situation in Pokrovsk. Ukraine outnumbered, the city virtually encircled. It is difficult, I know, to get reinforcements into Pokrovsk and wounded Ukrainian soldiers out of Pokrovsk. But I think it's a situation that is going to change day by day, Chuck, don't you think?
Yep, I do. And one thing I would say right now, in terms of ground lines of communication, Ukraine has got numerous avenues to put men and materiel into Pokrovsk. The gap There's a yawning mouth, as we've seen, not in hundreds, but dozens of battle spaces. But right now, it's about, it's almost 6 miles from tip to tip. And there's one thing in this war that we have seen is the Russians cannot do what Omar Bradley would do, what General Patton would do, what General Sherman would do. They can't take two lobes and close in on them. They do it. They haven't taken Stinky yet. And it's what? I don't know. How long have I been making jokes about Stinky? What, 30 years?
At least.
Right. I go to. So anyway, Battle of Pokrovsk, we'll see.
Okay. So there is additional urban fighting in another city, Kupiansk. And so let's compare urban map to urban map here. We'll leave Pokrovsk, go to Kupiansk. Same situation. Russia begins its urban warfare with these infiltration of sabotage and reconnaissance units. Pretty elite troops. This is one reason I guess I'm surprised that the very first thing these troops do, whether it's in Pokrovsk or in Kupiansk, they murder unarmed civilians.
Yeah, that's yeah. It doesn't amaze me anymore, but I don't want people to not feel the horror. Okay, these are who's left in Kupiansk at this time? It is literally someone's grandmother who has just said, "I worked all my life for this apartment. This is all I have in the world. I'm staying here." And some thug kicks her door in and bayonets her. I mean, don't let that outrage leave you. I mean, it is the definition of a war crime. And it also just, I wondered, in fact, in fury and disgust in Bucha, where I thought, here's these retreating Russian paratroopers, but they still have time to round up and kill hundreds of civilians. Right? What is the military objective? Besides the fact you're an American soldier, you get that order over the radio, it's an unlawful order. You obey it, and you are as guilty as the person who gave it. Obviously, there's no such compunctions in the Russian armed forces, but it's an outrage. But it also diminishes whatever energy you're putting into the military objective. Right? You take time for a couple casual rapes or to kill somebody's grandmother, you're not doing what you should be doing. But it isn't a surprise when you've got tens of thousands of violent felons in your army, right? And the bacillus of their criminality just spreads out. They're the guys that it starts out as barracks thievery. Then they knife somebody they don't agree with. Then they steal on and on and on. So they poisoned their own army. And of course, when you have criminal commanders and literal criminal soldiers, you're going to get this stuff.
Yeah. So to look at the urban map in Kupiansk, and we will be looking again at more focused street by street maps in Kupiansk, just as we will in Pokrovsk. That infiltration has widened, or it's deepened, I guess would be the correct word to use here, along the EP71 highway in particular. So this is the upper town of Kupiansk. It's a city divided by the Oskil River, and the Russians are infiltrating the higher city of Kupiansk, while Ukraine remains in pretty good control of the lower town. So I mean, this again is a very interesting situation, very dynamic. The Ukrainians to the east of the river, the Russians to the west of the river. You'd almost expect the reverse.
Yeah, and here's the money shot on the map of Kupiansk, and you can see these two tendrils extending down into the city on the either side of the P79. Here's the money shot. Look to the north, and you can see contour lines, and there is a a couple of hills, a broad valley, a water course, uphill, then into a band of forest that you could see touches the lower P79 highway designator. That is where the war, the battle for Kupiansk is going to be won or lost. In that area, that red tendril, that is the Russians' ground line of communication and supply. It is mostly open.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything that the Russians need to maintain their lodgements on that side, it's got to come through there. So, there's part of me, I look at this, and Ukrainian commanders are always resource challenged, and they are constantly looking at where is the least harmful place I can let the Russians advance. And the clinic for that is what goes on every day in Kremenna, right? I am happy to work, and in even the northern salient above Pokrovsk, I'm happy to let the Russians attack in the wrong direction and gobble up all the ground they wanted. Okay, here we're looking at something, maybe it's a little edgier play because you've allowed them to come into the city, but the ground line of communication that goes up north is extremely tenuous. And I'd also point out, and Alan pointed this out last time, as long as eastern Kupiansk is in the hands of the Ukrainians, it's virtually the same thing. Taking Bakhmut while Chasiv Yar remained to the west was never going to be a victory. And in this case, it's the geography is reversed, but the outcome is the same. Taking western Kupiansk while eastern Kupiansk is in the hands of the Ukrainians, that doesn't work either. Because you look to the south part of this map, it's all open and unoccupied, and Ukraine can send in whatever it needs that way. So again, it's not good that the Russians are in Kupiansk, but I would be much more alarmed if they had taken the eastern part of the city, because they could mob people in there and make a logistics base out of that. But again, the Ukrainians know how to fight. They have held on to Petropavlivka, and they have kept the Russians out of eastern Kupiansk.
Actually, the Russians attempted to take Petropavlivka 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times. It's high ground. It is critical to the defense of Kupiansk. The Ukrainians never, ever really allowed Russians to occupy that high ground. It's the Oskil River here it cuts through this river valley. Petropavlivka is the high ground on one side, and the high town of Kupiansk is the high ground on the other side. I think Ukraine on the eastern side of the Oskil is in a pretty good position.
Yeah, and there is a reason why the Russians have tried so hard to get Petropavlivka, and just look around it. You see all that open terrain, no forest, no nothing, and you see those little bands of windbreak around the forest. Look, Alan and I walk these fields. You're out there, and you have sunflowers for cover, right?
Yeah,
you are in the wide open. And when we were north of Kupiansk, I mean, a couple of times you and I were looking up into the sky. I know I was.
Oh yeah. And the only flying object we saw actually was a Ukrainian plane, one of those converted crop dusters, on air defense, looking for Russian drones. And that was pretty exciting. I mean, it was like, what the heck is that?
I've got a big cheer from all of us there. Yeah. So actually, when I first heard it, my back was turned, and I thought, "Oh, that's a big drone." But it was a good guys.
So the other thing about the urban battle that's going to unfold in Kupiansk, it is more likely that Ukraine could cut off those Russian troops who've made it into the high town of Kupiansk than it is that they're going to cut off Russian troops who have infiltrated Pokrovsk. At least the way I read this map, Chuck.
Yep, I think so as well. And the Oskil River here, so this we're talking about the liabilities of this Russian ground line of communication. They've got to cross the Oskil River, right? And it isn't the biggest river in the world there, but if something, a body of water is wider than half your living room, it'll stop a tank, right? So that means crossing points, and the Russians have to bring up combat engineers and put either a pontoon section or a bridging section over these parts of the river, and those get seen by drones, and then they get seen by HIMARS, and et cetera. So this lodgment in Kupiansk, not ideal, but as Alan sagely pointed out as we've been talking about this, that Russian general would do anything he could to trade what he has now for what he could get across the river. So we'll see. And remember, you've got these guys in there. Their life expectancy in an urban battle in continuous combat is measured 24, 36, 48 hours, right? So every time I was ever in urban contact, I always had the clock running in my head. And of course, look, I'm a raiding force, right? You don't hire the SEALs to occupy anything. You hire us to take it, and we've got to get in and get out. But especially in urban combat, my clock was always running because I had to worry about getting surrounded and taken out. And my worries are just what these Russian commanders face. Because your building gets surrounded, you're no longer mutually supported with whatever elements you have. And again, an infantry mission is different than a SEAL mission. But in terms of sweating and bleeding and dying, the equivalency is still there. So the Russians may have bitten a chunk out here, but let's see if they can chew it and swallow it. I'm not sure they can.
So let's move to the next map. And we're, in a way, moving out of urban warfare into more open ground. And this is around Kreminna. Even though the Russian goal is the city of Liman, if they were ever to reach Liman, you are going to see that that urban landscape battle unfold again. But they have a long way to go to get to Liman. And it's all open ground. I know we have talked for weeks now about how successfully the Ukrainians have held on around Torsky and Zarachene. They continue to, but the Russians have crossed the river there.
Yeah, and this again is we talked about Ukrainian commanders. They know how to trade dirt for time, and they're allowing the Russians to pour manpower, resources, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition into a bit of an irrelevant advance. So you see how far the Russians have advanced across the river there. And, okay, so there they are, and they're getting to Chandri Holovy and Vovchi Yar. They're almost there. If you draw the line straight down, that's their target, Liman. So the Russians have been allowed again to advance in a fairly innocuous direction. And you can see those stripes there. Every one of my sources is almost mutually contradictory. I'd also point out that this striped area has been taken by the Russians before. So this battle line truly goes back and forth. I'm not even sure it's a battle line. This is one of those zones of ambiguity that have occurred in 21st century combat because you've got a 20-kilometer drone zone. Look, the thing the Russians want on this map is Liman. I just don't see them getting here. But we do have to report that, the Russians have made progress in the last 48 hours here in Kreminna. But this one this one phrase keeps popping up. President Zelensky saying Ukrainians are outnumbered 8-1 in Pokrovsk. Ukrainians have been outnumbered 8 and 10 and even 15-1 in Kremenna for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
This is the most underachieving section of the Russian invasion. They have basically done nothing, but now they have broken through in the wrong direction, or at least in the wrong place.
Yeah, and that wide open territory between Torsky and Liman is going to become a kill zone for the Russians. And there's really no opportunity on this map for the Russians to launch one of those concentrated mechanized assaults unless they want to lose 20 more vehicles.
And there is the really interesting thing in this war. Whoever, one of the things you have to do is you designate the troops you're going to use, you converge them to get them to the, jumping off point, and you send them. But these attacks get broken up because Ukraine never fails to recognize when the Russians are gathering their forces for one of these attacks. And as we've seen 3 times in the last 5 days, and at least 20 times that just come to mind off the top of my head, and we've seen multiple battalions, and this was in Kupiansk, that the Russians launched an attack trying to get to the Oskil River. They were destroyed in 25 minutes, 2 battalions. It probably one of the biggest victories of the war. We're ranking up there with Vuhledar 1 and 2. So again, a couple of things happen. The Russians don't have the kind of tactical commanders who can do armored warfare, mechanized warfare. They don't have the troops that can carry it out, and they don't have the luxury of consolidating forces to move, because Ukrainian tactical intelligence is that good, and there is a new weapon in the 21st century, which is the drone. It doesn't miss. Right? In my day, a laser-guided bomb, look, sometimes they didn't hit the target. Sometimes we lased the wrong target. But these FPV drones, man.
They don't miss.
They don't miss.
Now, whether you are a lone infantryman or whether you are a vehicle on the road or on the roadside, they don't miss. And, it's kind of a remarkable aspect of battles everywhere in Ukraine right now. A good part of the war is one-on-one combat between a drone and an infantry soldier.
It was interesting, and I reported today, again, I wish I could credit the guy who came up with the stat, but remember when we were speaking to the medical director there in Kramatorsk, only 18% of the casualties he processes are actually bullet wounds.
Right.
A little over 80% are shrapnel injuries, which is from first-person drones, and that would also mean artillery, mortars, etc. And it didn't break it down by that, but I would say 70% of that 80% is FPV drone. So the infantry rifle has fallen. And again, you think about it, a good marksman can engage targets at 400 yards, right? I'd expect any competent infantryman to hit a pie plate at 400 yards. Drone can hit you at 20 kilometers.
Yeah.
Right? Wow.
Yeah. It can track you. And it's the drone is going to win, basically.
It is. And we'll get into this after the war, but the most experienced army in the world right now is the Ukrainian army.
Mm-hmm. Right?
War has changed. Some things it hasn't changed fundamentally. It's not turned inside out, but there is a new weapon. And I love the way we can talk to General Hodges and other people who way above my pay grade, and they see it. It isn't just the drone that has changed warfare, which is important, but it has emphasized the importance of the black arts of electronic warfare, right? You've got to dominate all of the electromagnetic spectrum. Everything from simply camouflaging your vehicle, and now you're working in the spectrum of light, to denying the enemy flight control, reconnaissance, video feeds, all of that stuff. That is going to underlay war going forward from now on.
Chuck, I wonder if you think the tempo of the Russian assaults and the use of these mechanized columns, as well as the intensity of the air assault on Ukrainian infrastructure, on the electric grid, the tempo has increased in both cases. But in a way, I think it has an air of desperation about it. And this is because Putin is imposing these deadlines.
He's imposing those deadlines. And the other thing that he sees is, it's oil that fuels the money that fuels the war. And he sees that, although it's fun for them to hit nursing homes and hospitals and apartment buildings with 6 shaheeds, as we saw in Kharkiv, that horrible strike we reported from, Ukraine has never indulged in the luxury of vengeance. They use their long-range precision strike munitions to hit oil refineries and transport and also electrical substations, etc. Because look, oil refineries, they need energy, right? If you cut off the electricity to oil fire, it's not working. And as our friend Will can tell us, there are more targets within a refinery that are more high value than others. Ukraine has got petroleum engineers like Will picking their targets out, and the money's running out for Putin. And Putin also knows, look, he reads history too. Caligula, Nero, etc. When the Praetorian Guard turns against you, translate oligarchs, you're dead. And let's see how much, look, these guys want they want their yachts in Monaco with the Swedish bikini team. That's going away, right?
Yeah.
All that good, folks.
Yeah.
All that. And the war is still unwinnable, right? It's unwinnable for Russia.
I think that really is the key question, Chuck, that you're focusing on here. And that is, how does time run out in a war or for a dictator? And I think that time is running out faster for Putin than it is for Ukraine, because Ukraine is never going to stop fighting. And this is something that they have proved from the very first days of the war. Look, the current director of the CIA, John Radcliffe, said in testimony in the United States Senate that he believed, if necessary, Ukrainians would fight with their bare hands to the end of this war.
Absolutely. And I am happy to remind everybody, 4 years ago, I thought he won't invade. This isn't a war he can win. It's going to have so many negative geopolitical effects. The game is not worth the candle. So I'm still a long war guy, right? 4 years ago, I was saying 4 years. 4 years later, I see at least 2, maybe 3 more years. But what I don't see in 3 more years is a Russian victory. I just don't. And Alan, you and I were there at the frontline fortress cities where defiantly and beautifully Ukrainian men and women went along conspicuously just living their lives.
Yeah.
Just living their lives.
Which, as a matter of fact, they were doing in Pokrovsk just a number of weeks and months ago. We're going to be back later this week with many more maps as these situations unfold in the various cities, Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, and Kremenna. Well, one last question for you, though, Chuck. Will Ukrainian commanders be asked again about the defense of Pokrovsk? Did they choose to stay defending this one place for too long? at too high a cost?
I don't think we're there yet. I think weighing the dynamics of the urban battlefield. So, at the highest level, National Command Authority level, they've got to look at it this way. Do we want 6 months from now, we want to see that the Russians have suffered another 100,000 casualties to take the pile of rubble that will be Pokrovsk? The pile of rubble that was Bakhmut, the pile of rubble that is, Severodonetsk. Maybe that's in the national interest. The other thing is, if the Russians take Pokrovsk, and we said this about Bakhmut and we said this about Severodonetsk, Ukraine is not going to fall. These are not keystone cities. Anyone who tells you the vital logistics of Pokrovsk, it was a year ago.
Right.
Now, it's a frontline city. And as Alan and I saw, and anyone who's been to Ukraine, the Russians destroy everything they can reach. They destroy it. There isn't anything left. Look at Mariupol, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of bodies in mass graves. Mariupol, right? And so, in the national interest, is it worth bloodying the Russians' noses? I think it is for a while. And especially when Pokrovsk appears to be situated so that Ukraine can easily, if it chooses, to move resources, men, weapons, material into that fight.
Okay.
I don't know. That's above my pay grade. So,
And even though Russians outnumber Ukrainians 8-1 around Pokrovsk, as well as elsewhere on the zero line, it's always important to remember that Ukraine inflicts 5 times the losses on advancing Russian forces. So the loss ratio is 5-1 in Ukraine's favor. It's a brutal statistic to talk about, but that is actually how you win a war of attrition, even when you're fighting a monster, a Goliath like Russia.
and just very briefly, look, numbers don't always tell the story, right? I promise you, if you go around Twitter this afternoon and look, you're going to see a Ukrainian drone dropping a grenade into a Russian tank that has all the hatches open. That's the story, right? Those tankers don't want to drive that tank across a minefield. It is not a freaking coincidence that they leave every hatch on that vehicle open because they want it to be destroyed. They've got 8-1 superiority, but those units have 20% combat efficiency, and they lose 30 to 80% every time they hit a Ukrainian unit. That's why they're never going to win this war.
Yeah.
I'm still a long war guy, but 3 years from now, there's not going to be the Russian victory parade in Kyiv. That is never going to happen.
No, I don't think it will. And here we are entering the 4th winter of Ukraine's self-defense. I really want to urge people to follow Chuck on Twitter and to download the maps he produces almost every single day, enlarge them, take a close look at them, and compare them from day to day and from week to week to week. That is almost the only way you can see reliably how these events are unfolding. So it's not just here on Indications and Warnings. I would encourage you to spend as much time with Chuck's maps as you possibly can. And while you're at it, give Indications and Warnings here on YouTube a like, subscribe. Please leave your comments below. Chuck and I will get to just as many of them as we possibly can. We like the conversation with our viewers. So remember, like, subscribe, and suggest to your friends and your colleagues. You want some real news about Ukraine, from a military expert who has watched this war from the very beginning. Come over to indications and warnings. Tell us what you think.
We thank you, folks. We thank you for spending time with us. And as Alan said, look, your questions and your comments are always welcome. So we want to help you dominate your information war microcosm. So hang with us. We'll get you there.
Thank you, Chuck. And Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. Thank you, everybody. Good night.